Warning, full spoilers for the episode below. South Park's 20th season seemed to be one of the more divisive in the show's long history, and even Trey Parker and Matt Stone seemed pretty burnt out on political humor and continuity-driven episodes by the end. Parker and Stone have been adamant ever since that season 21 will take the show back to its roots, focusing less on topical humor and more on the wacky antics of Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. But apparently they changed their minds at some point in the last few months, because white people renovating houses didn't seem much like classic South Park. While there's no sign of President Garrison or the member berries yet, it seems the show will remain as topical as ever. Not that this approach is inherently good or bad. I generally enjoyed season 20, but my chief complaint is that it tended to grow repetitive after a while. With the online trolling and presidential race storylines dominating the show week after week, there was never any room for goofy little standalone episodes or really anything outside of the same handful of plot beats. It's hard to say just how continuity-driven season 21 will be, but the fact that this episode didn't end on a cliffhanger suggests that Parker and Stone are aiming for at least a slightly more episodic format this time around. That's probably for the best. Nor can you blame Parker, Stone and the rest of the writers for backing down from their no politics pledge when the U.S. political landscape is arguably even more heated and bizarre than it was a year ago. With the events in Charlottesville still fresh in everyone's minds, now's the perfect time for South Park to weigh in on the resurgent white supremacy movement and the country's inflamed racial tensions. Except that's not really what happened with white people renovating houses. Sure, the episode tackled white nationalism on a superficial level, with plenty of shots of angry hillbillies waving Confederate flags about. But it chose to focus a lot more on the economic anxiety that supposedly fuels white nationalists rather than the plain, simple racism. South Park has taken some flack lately for what many see as the show's tendency to pull its punches and lean in a slightly more right-wing friendly direction. I don't fully agree with those criticisms, but it's harder to argue against them with episodes like this. I was hoping for an Insideville take on the fallout of Charlottesville, and instead this episode dusted off that they took our jobs. Crew and treated the whole situation as if it boils down to a bunch of rednecks fretting over Google and Amazon putting them out of business. Generally, the weakest episodes of South Park in recent years are those that seem to choose several hot-button topics at random and crudely splice them together into one whole. Not unlike the Manatee Writers' Room from Cartoon Wars, Part 2, in other words. White people renovating houses is one of those cases. Here you had the writers juggling white nationalism, the popularity of HGTV's programming and the current Amazon Alexa/Google Assistant fad all at the same time. Individually, these three elements showed potential, but they never came together as a satisfying whole. This episode mostly whiffed the ball when it came to white nationalism, but it did score a few points when it came to Randy's latest career change. The show's spoof of HGTV interchangeable programming was pretty dead on, especially with the sum total of Randy's home improvement knowledge revolving around taking down the kitchen wall for a more open concept. And there is something to the idea that these home renovation shows are basically an outlet for middle-class white people to bury their heads in the sand and daydream about a version of the American dream that's pretty much out of reach to much of the nation. It's an idea that needed further development, but we'll see if Randy's new gig stays in place beyond this episode. Ultimately, it's telling that the strongest portions of this episode were the ones that focused less on topical matters and more on the kids goofing around. Cartman's endless fascination with Alexa was amusing, particularly during his grand symphony. Cartman's frayed relationship with Heidi also proved surprisingly enjoyable. That romantic subplot was probably the weakest part of season 20. But these days, Cartman seems as exasperated by their relationship as I was last year. The Cartman/Heidi romance feels a lot more genuine at this late stage. And after seeing him play the squeaky clean, kindly boyfriend for so long, there's a certain satisfaction in watching the old, manipulative Cartman rear his head once more. It's been too long,